I never thought a simple workout would change my entire life. But as I stood there in that fluorescent lit gym, watching security cameras being pulled from the walls, while a room full of strangers stared at me like I was some kind of criminal, I realized that sometimes the most ordinary moments can become your greatest battles. My name is Maya, and what I'm about to tell you is the true story of how one woman's racism nearly destroyed everything I'd worked for my reputation, my career, even my sense of safety in my own neighborhood. But what she didn't know was that her hatred would ultimately expose secrets that went far deeper than anyone could have imagined. This isn't just another Karen story. This is about power, prejudice, and the moment when staying silent is no longer an option. Let me take you back to 6 months ago. I had just moved to Riverside Commons, one of those planned communities where the grass is always perfectly manicured and every house looks like it belongs in a catalog. As a 28-year-old software developer, I'd saved for 3 years to afford a place here. It wasn't just about the house, it was about the amenities. The community pool, the walking trails, and most importantly to me, the premium fitness center that came with my HOA fees. You have to understand, fitness isn't just a hobby for me. It's how I cope with the stress of my job, how I clear my head after long days of coding, how I connect with my own strength. Growing up, I was always the awkward kid with thick glasses and a book in her hand. It wasn't until college that I discovered weight training, and it literally transformed not just my body, but my entire sense of self-worth. The Riverside Commons gym wasn't huge, but it was perfect. Clean, well-equipped, and usually pretty quiet. I'd developed a routine Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings, right after work around 6:30 p.m. I kept to myself, wore my noise-canceling headphones, and focused on my workout. For the first 2 months, everything was peaceful. I'd nod politely to the other regulars, help spot someone if they asked, and generally minded my own business. The gym had maybe 15 people max during my usual time, and we all seemed to coexist just fine. But then I noticed her. Linda Hartwell, 50-something, perfectly styled blonde hair that never seemed to move no matter how hard she worked out, and this way of scanning the room like she was taking inventory of everything that was wrong. She'd been going to that gym for 7 years. I later learned long before the neighborhood had become as diverse as it was now. At first, our interactions were minimal. A tight smile when we passed each other. Her eyes lingering on me just a beat too long when I was at the squat rack or doing deadlifts. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe she was just naturally intense, or maybe she was one of those people who took fitness really seriously. But then came the night that changed everything. It was a Wednesday in early October. I remember because the gym had these huge windows facing west, and the autumn sunset was painting everything golden. I was halfway through my workout, doing my usual circuit chest presses, rows, some core work. I was wearing a black sports bra and matching leggings, the same type of outfit I'd worn dozens of times before. I was at the cable machine, focused on my form, when I noticed Linda hovering nearby. Not working out, just watching. When I finished my set and reached for my water bottle, she approached. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying this tone of forced politeness that immediately put me on edge. "I couldn't help but notice your outfit choice tonight." I looked down at myself, confused. "I'm sorry?" "It's just that this is a family-friendly facility," she continued, her eyes doing this obvious up and down scan of my body. "And some of your workout attire might be considered distracting to the other members." The words hit me like ice water. I've replayed this moment in my head 1,000 times since then, and I still remember exactly how my stomach dropped, how my face got hot, how suddenly I felt like every person in that gym was staring at me. "Distracting?" I managed to ask. Linda glanced meaningfully toward the other side of the gym, where two middle-aged men were using the elliptical machines. Well, you know how men can be. And this is a respectable community. We all need to be mindful of appropriateness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. I looked around the gym and noticed two other women, both white, wearing similar or even more revealing workout attire. One was in tiny shorts and a crop top. The other had on a sports bra that showed significantly more skin than mine. "I think my outfit is perfectly appropriate," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's standard gym attire." Linda's smile got tighter. "I'm just trying to help you understand the community standards here. We pride ourselves on maintaining a certain atmosphere." The way she said atmosphere made my skin crawl. There was something in her tone, something in the way she was looking at me, that made it clear this wasn't really about my clothes at all. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, grabbing my towel and heading toward the locker room. I needed to get away from her before I said something I'd regret. But as I was changing, I heard Linda's voice carrying from the main gym floor. She was talking to Jerry, one of the regular guys, in a voice loud enough that I couldn't help but overhear. "I just think we need to maintain certain standards," she was saying. "I mean, when people dress inappropriately, it creates an uncomfortable environment for everyone. Especially when they're, trying to get attention." My hands shook as I packed up my gym bag. This wasn't over. I could feel it in my bones. This was just the beginning, and something told me Linda Hartwell was the type of person who didn't let things go. As I walked to my car that night, I found myself looking over my shoulder, wondering what I'd gotten myself into just by trying to live my life. The golden sunset that had seemed so beautiful an hour earlier now felt ominous, like a warning of storms to come. I had no idea how right I was. But I also had no idea what Linda was really hiding or how far she'd be willing to go to protect her secrets. The next few months would test everything I thought I knew about justice, community, and my own strength. What would you have done? Would you have confronted her right then? Or would you have tried to avoid conflict like I did? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, I'm still not sure I handled it the right way. But what I did next would set off a chain of events that none of us saw coming. The next week, I almost convinced myself the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. Maybe Linda was just having a bad day. Maybe I'd misread her tone. I wanted so badly to believe that I'd imagined the racial undertones in her comments, because the alternative that I was being targeted simply for existing in a space I had every right to be in was too exhausting to accept. But Linda had other plans. It started small. Every time I entered the gym, she'd be there within 5 minutes, watching me. Not subtly either. She'd position herself at a machine with a direct line of sight to wherever I was working out, and I could feel her eyes tracking my every movement. Then came the helpful comments. If I was doing squats, she'd appear to mention how important proper form was for safety reasons. If I was using the free weights, she'd make casual remarks about how some people needed to be more considerate of others, waiting to use equipment even when the gym was practically empty. The worst part was how she'd involve other people. She had this way of making her observations sound like community concerns. "Maya seems really dedicated to her fitness routine," she'd say to other gym members within earshot. "I just hope everyone feels comfortable here, you know? It's important that we all respect each other's space." It was masterful, really. She never said anything overtly inappropriate, never used language that could be clearly identified as harassment. But the message was clear. I was the problem. I was making people uncomfortable. I didn't belong. After 2 weeks of this, I started changing my workout schedule. Maybe if I came earlier or later, I could avoid her entirely. But Linda seemed to have an uncanny ability to show up whenever I did. Later, I would learn this wasn't a coincidence. She'd been tracking my car in the parking lot and timing her workouts accordingly. The breaking point came on a Friday night in late October. I'd had a particularly brutal week at work. A major software deployment had gone sideways. I'd been pulling 12-hour days, and I desperately needed the mental reset that only a good workout could provide. I was doing deadlifts, one of my favorite exercises because it requires total focus and makes me feel powerful. I had my headphones in, and for the first time in weeks, I was actually losing myself in the rhythm of the workout. That's when Linda struck. I was between sets, toweling off sweat, when I noticed her talking to Marcus, the evening shift manager. Marcus was a good guy, early 30s, always friendly, the kind of person who remembered your name and asked about your weekend. But as I watched their conversation, I saw his expression change from polite attention to concern to something that looked almost like alarm. Linda was gesturing in my direction, speaking in low, urgent tones. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but Marcus kept glancing over at me with this increasingly uncomfortable look on his face. Finally, Marcus walked over to where I was standing. "Hey, Maya," he said, and I could hear the reluctance in his voice. "Could I talk to you for a minute, privately?" My stomach dropped. Of course. We walked over to the corner of the gym, near the emergency exit. Marcus looked like he was about to deliver bad news to a family member. "Look, I really hate to even bring this up," he started, "but I've received a complaint about your workout attire and behavior in the gym." My behavior? The word came out sharper than I intended. "The complaint is that your clothing choices are inappropriate for a family facility, and that you've been, the complaint suggests that you might be intentionally trying to distract other gym members." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Marcus, you've seen me in here dozens of times. Have I ever done anything inappropriate? Have I ever bothered anyone? No, of course not. That's why this is so awkward for me. You're one of our most respectful members. But I have to follow up on complaints, especially when they involve potential violations of the community guidelines." I looked over at Linda, who was pretending to stretch, but obviously listening to every word. "Who made this complaint?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I can't tell you that, but Maya, between you and me, I think this might be more about someone's personal issues than anything you've actually done. But my hands are tied. I have to document it and let you know that if we receive additional complaints, we might have to have a more formal discussion." The humiliation was overwhelming. Here I was, being treated like some kind of predator for the crime of being a black woman who dared to exercise in form-fitting clothing. The same clothing that white women wore in this gym every single day, without anyone batting an eye. "I understand," I said quietly. "Is there anything specific I need to change? Just maybe consider more conservative workout attire going forward? I know it's not fair, but it might help avoid future issues." I nodded, gathered my things, and left without finishing my workout. As I walked to my car, I could feel Linda's eyes on my back, and I swear I could sense her satisfaction from 50 feet away. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of wine and cried. Not just from anger, but from a deep, bone-tired exhaustion that came from constantly having to prove my right to exist in spaces where others were simply welcome. I thought about my parents, who had fought through segregation and discrimination to give me opportunities they never had. What would they think of their daughter being driven out of a gym in 2024? But then something shifted. The tears stopped, and something harder took their place. I wasn't going to be driven away. I wasn't going to let Linda Hartwell's prejudice win. If she wanted a fight, I'd give her one, but I was going to fight smart. The next morning, I did something I probably should have done weeks earlier. I started documenting everything. Every interaction, every helpful comment, every time Linda appeared when I was working out. I bought a small notebook and started keeping detailed records with dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes when possible. I also started researching. I looked up the gym's actual policies, the HOA bylaws, and the community guidelines. What I found was interesting. There was nothing in any official document that supported Linda's claims about appropriate attire or family-friendly standards for the fitness center. If anything, the promotional materials for Riverside Commons specifically highlighted the gym's welcoming, inclusive atmosphere. More importantly, I started paying attention to patterns. I noticed that Linda never approached the white women who wore similar or more revealing workout clothes. I documented the times she made her community standards comments and noted who else was present and what they were wearing. But what I discovered next would change everything. Linda wasn't just targeting me in the gym. She'd been asking questions about me around the neighborhood. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, mentioned that Linda had stopped by asking about my work schedule, whether I had overnight guests, if I'd been having loud parties on weekends. None of this was true. Of course, I'm basically a hermit who spends my evenings coding or reading, but Linda was clearly trying to build some kind of case against me. The most disturbing discovery came when I was checking my car one evening after a workout. There, tucked under my windshield wiper, was a printed note. No signature, no return address, just a typed message. Some people don't understand that certain communities have standards. Maybe it would be better if you found a gym that's more suitable for your lifestyle. I stared at that note for a long time, my hands shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. This had gone way beyond inappropriate gym comments. This was intimidation. This was someone trying to drive me out of my own neighborhood. But Linda had made a critical mistake. She'd escalated to written threats, which meant I now had concrete evidence of harassment. And more importantly, she'd underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. You see, what Linda didn't know, what none of them knew, was that before I became a software developer, I'd spent 2 years in law school. I'd dropped out to pursue tech, but I'd learned enough about harassment law, civil rights, and evidence gathering to know that Linda was walking into legal quicksand. The question was, how far was I willing to go to stop her? And what other secrets might come to light once I started digging into Linda Hartwell's perfect suburban life? I was about to find out that this Jim Karen had a lot more to hide than simple racism. And once I started pulling that thread, the entire fabric of her carefully constructed reputation would begin to unravel. Would you have backed down at this point, or would you have fought back? Because what I did next would expose secrets that went to the very heart of our community. The note under my windshield was the catalyst I needed. The next morning, I walked into the Riverside Commons management office with a folder full of documentation and a very clear goal. I was going to file a formal harassment complaint against Linda Hartwell. The property manager, Jennifer Mills, was a sharp woman in her 40s who'd been running HOA communities for over a decade. She listened to my story with the practiced attention of someone who'd seen it all before, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. "This is concerning," she said after I'd laid out the timeline of events. "We take harassment seriously here, especially anything that might constitute discrimination. I'll need to investigate this thoroughly." "I appreciate that," I said. "But I also want to be prepared for the possibility that this escalates further. Is there anything else I should know about Linda Hartwell? Has she been involved in any other incidents?" Jennifer paused, and I caught something in her expression, a flicker of recognition, maybe even resignation. "I can't discuss other residents' files," she said carefully. "But I will say that your complaint will be added to our record, and any patterns of behavior will be taken into account." Patterns of behavior. That phrase stuck with me as I left the office. It suggested this wasn't Linda's first rodeo, which made me wonder who else had she targeted. That evening, I decided to do some old-fashioned detective work. I'd lived in Riverside Commons for 6 months, but I'd been so focused on work and settling in that I hadn't really gotten to know my neighbors. That was about to change. My first stop was Mrs. Peterson next door. Eleanor Peterson was in her 70s, a retired teacher who always had the most beautiful flower garden and who'd brought me cookies when I first moved in. "Oh, honey," she said, when I mentioned Linda, "that woman has been a thorn in everyone's side for years. Come in, let me make us some tea." Over the next hour, Eleanor painted a picture of Linda that was both illuminating and disturbing. According to Eleanor, Linda had a history of targeting residents she deemed undesirable: a young single mother who supposedly had too many male visitors, an elderly Asian gentleman who practiced Tai Chi in the common areas, inappropriate use of community space, and a Hispanic family whose teenage son played music too loudly in the afternoons. "The thing is," Eleanor said, stirring honey into her tea, "Linda has this way of making her complaints sound reasonable. She talks about property values and community standards, but those of us who've been here a while can see the pattern." "Has anyone ever fought back?" I asked. Eleanor's expression darkened. The young mother, Jessica, tried. She filed complaints with the HOA, documented everything, just like you're doing. But Linda has connections on the board, and she's very good at making people's lives difficult until they give up and move away. Connections on the board? Her husband, Robert, was the HOA treasurer for 3 years. He stepped down last year, but Linda still has influence. And she's friends with Patricia Vance, the current president. This was news to me. I'd been treating Linda as an individual problem, but she was part of a network. No wonder she'd been so confident in her harassment. She thought she was untouchable. "What happened to Jessica?" I asked. "She moved out about 8 months ago. Said the stress wasn't worth it, especially with a young daughter to think about." Linda got what she wanted. I left Eleanor's house with a heavy heart, but also with determination. Linda had driven out other residents through her campaign of harassment and intimidation. I wasn't going to be next. Over the following week, I reached out to other neighbors, always casually, always carefully. The picture that emerged was of a woman who used her position and connections to systematically make life unbearable for anyone she deemed unfit for her community. But then I discovered something that changed everything. I was having coffee with Tom Rodriguez, who lived 3 streets over and worked in IT for a local bank. We were talking about the neighborhood when he mentioned something that made me nearly choke on my latte. "Yeah, Linda's always been weird about the gym," he said. "Even before you moved in, she was constantly complaining about people using it inappropriately. But it's funny, she never seems to actually work out herself." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I go to the gym most mornings before work, and I see her there all the time, but she's never actually exercising. She just watches people, takes pictures sometimes, says it's for documenting safety violations or whatever." Takes pictures. Something cold settled in my stomach. Pictures of what? Other members working out, mostly women. She claims it's for complaints to the management company, but honestly, it's creepy as hell. There's this one woman, Sarah, who stopped coming entirely because Linda kept photographing her during her workouts. I felt like pieces of a puzzle were clicking into place. Linda wasn't just a racist neighbor with boundary issues. She was systematically photographing women in the gym, using community standards as cover for what was essentially voyeuristic behavior. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those photos, about how violated I'd feel if someone had been secretly documenting my workouts. But more than that, I started thinking about the legal implications. If Linda was photographing people in the gym without consent, especially in workout attire, that could constitute a serious violation of privacy laws. The next morning, I called Jennifer Mills again. "I need to ask you something," I said. Are residents allowed to take photographs in the fitness center? There was a pause. Absolutely not. Photography in the gym is strictly prohibited for privacy reasons. It's posted on signs, and it's in the community guidelines. Why do you ask? Because I have reason to believe Linda Hartwell has been photographing other gym members without their consent. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. That's a very serious allegation, Jennifer finally said. If you have evidence of this, I need to know immediately. I'm working on gathering evidence, but I wanted to confirm the policy first. If someone were doing this, what would be the consequences? Immediate suspension of gym privileges at minimum. Depending on the scope and nature of the photographs, we might be looking at lease violations, potential legal action, even eviction. After hanging up, I realized I'd reached a crossroads. I could continue documenting Linda's harassment and hope the HOA would eventually take action. Or I could investigate the photography allegations and potentially uncover something much bigger. I chose the latter. That weekend, I did something I'm not entirely proud of, but which I felt was necessary. I started surveillance of my own. I positioned myself in the gym during Linda's usual times, but instead of working out, I watched her. And what I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. Linda would enter the gym with her phone and a small digital camera. She'd pretend to use equipment near other women, particularly women of color, and she'd take photos. Sometimes openly, claiming she was documenting inappropriate behavior, sometimes more discreetly. She had dozens of photos on her phone. I could see her scrolling through them. But the most damning evidence came when I overheard a phone conversation she was having in the parking lot after one of her workout sessions. "The new ones are good," she was saying to whoever was on the other end, especially the black girl in the tight clothes. "Really clear shots. Yeah, I'll email them to you tonight." I recorded that conversation on my phone, and suddenly, everything became clear. Linda wasn't just harassing me out of racism, though that was certainly part of it. She was using her complaint about inappropriate attire as cover for a photography operation that was both illegal and deeply disturbing. The question now was, who was she sending these photos to? And how many other women had been victimized by this scheme? What I discovered next would not only bring Linda down, but expose a network of voyeurism that went far beyond our little community gym. The web of deceit was about to unravel, and Linda Hartwell was about to learn that some people fight back harder than she ever imagined. But first, I had to gather enough evidence to make sure she couldn't wiggle out of this. And I had to do it without putting myself or other women at further risk. The confrontation was coming, and this time, I was going to be ready. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was doing something that made you question everything you thought you knew about them? Because what I found out about Linda's real activities would shock everyone in our community. Armed with recordings, witness statements, and my own documentation of Linda's behavior, I knew it was time to act. But I also knew I needed to be strategic. Linda had connections, influence, and a 7-year track record in this community. I was the newcomer making serious accusations. I needed my evidence to be bulletproof. I spent the weekend organizing everything into a comprehensive file: dates, times, witness statements, recordings, and most importantly, a detailed timeline showing the pattern of harassment that had escalated to potential criminal activity. Then I made copies of everything and prepared for war. Monday morning, I called in sick to work and headed straight to the local police station. The officer who took my report, Detective Sarah Chen, was thorough and professional. She listened to the recordings, reviewed my documentation, and took detailed notes. "This is definitely worth investigating," she said. "The photography without consent, especially in a gym setting, could constitute voyeurism, which is a felony in this state. And if she's distributing these images, we're looking at potential criminal harassment and invasion of privacy charges. What happens next? I asked. We'll need to obtain the devices and examine the photos. I'll also want to interview other potential victims. This kind of behavior usually has a long history. That afternoon, I requested an emergency meeting with the HOA board. Jennifer Mills had been supportive, but I needed to present my case to the people with real authority in the community. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, but Linda wasn't going to wait for a formal process. Tuesday night, I was working late when I heard my doorbell ring. It was nearly 9 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Linda standing on my porch with a man I recognized as her husband, Robert. My heart started racing. I considered not answering, but something told me this confrontation was inevitable. I might as well face it on my own terms. I opened the door, but kept the chain lock engaged. "What can I do for you, Linda?" "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "About these ridiculous accusations you've been spreading around the neighborhood." "I haven't spread any accusations," I said calmly. "I've reported harassment to the appropriate authorities." Robert stepped forward. He was a large man, probably 6'3", and his presence on my doorstep felt intentionally intimidating. "You're making some very serious claims against my wife," he said. "Claims that could damage her reputation in this community." "Her reputation should be based on her actions," I replied. "And her actions have been inappropriate and potentially illegal." Linda's composure cracked slightly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Maya. I've been protecting this community for years, keeping out people who don't understand our values. You come in here with your attitude and your inappropriate behavior, disrupting the peace we've worked so hard to maintain." "Inappropriate behavior?" I almost laughed. "Like working out in standard gym attire? Like existing while black in your precious community?" "Don't you dare play the race card," Linda snapped. "This has nothing to do with race. This is about respect and community standards." "Then explain the photos," I said quietly. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Linda went completely pale, and Robert's intimidating posture deflated like a punctured balloon. "What photos?" Linda stammered, but her voice had lost all its authority. "The photos you've been taking of women in the gym without their consent. The photos you've been distributing to unknown recipients. The photos that constitute felony voyeurism under state law." Robert grabbed Linda's arm. "We're leaving," he said quickly. "Don't contact us again." But Linda wasn't done. "You can't prove anything," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "And even if you could, nobody's going to believe some troublemaker who's been here 6 months over someone who's been a pillar of this community for 7 years. "We'll see about that," I said, and closed the door. But my hands were shaking as I turned the deadbolt. I'd struck a nerve, but I'd also escalated the conflict to a new level. Linda now knew that I knew about the photos, which made her desperate. And desperate people do dangerous things. I was right to be concerned. The next morning, I woke up to find my car's tires slashed and a new note tucked under my windshield wiper. Some people don't know when to mind their own business. That was it. The gloves were off. I called Detective Chen immediately, reported the vandalism, and moved up the timeline on everything. The police would execute a search warrant for Linda's devices that afternoon. The HOA meeting was moved to that evening. Everything was accelerating toward a confrontation that would determine not just my future in this community, but Linda's as well. Thursday evening arrived with an unseasonably cold wind that seemed to match the tension in the community center meeting room. The HOA board sat at a long table facing rows of folding chairs that were filling up with curious neighbors. Word had gotten around that something big was happening, though most people didn't know the details. Linda and Robert sat in the front row, surrounded by a few allies who still believed her version of events. She'd clearly spent the day rallying support because I could see several people shooting hostile glances in my direction. But I'd done my own preparation. Eleanor Peterson sat behind me for moral support. Tom Rodriguez was there to testify about the photography. Sarah Williams, the woman who'd stopped coming to the gym because of Linda's harassment, had driven over from her new apartment across town to speak on my behalf. At exactly 7 p.m. HOA President Patricia Vance called the meeting to order. Patricia was in her 50s, with the carefully neutral expression of someone who'd moderated a lot of community disputes over the years. "We're here tonight to address allegations of harassment between community members," she began. "This is a serious matter that affects all of us, and we're going to handle it with the respect and thoroughness it deserves." I presented my case first. 45 minutes of documented harassment, witness statements, and evidence of escalating intimidation. I played the recording of Linda discussing photos in the parking lot. I showed the threatening notes. I laid out a pattern of behavior that went far beyond personal conflict into criminal activity. The room was dead silent when I finished. You could feel the shift in energy. People who'd come expecting neighborhood drama were realizing they were witnessing something much more serious. Linda's response was exactly what I'd expected: denial, deflection, and attempts to portray herself as the victim. She talked about community values, about troublemakers who didn't respect the peaceful atmosphere they'd all worked to create. She claimed the photos were for legitimate complaints about gym safety and dress code violations. But then Patricia asked the question that changed everything. "Linda, I need you to explain why the police confiscated your phone and camera this afternoon as part of a criminal investigation into voyeurism and harassment." The room erupted. People started talking over each other, some demanding explanations, others expressing shock and disgust. Linda's face went through a series of expressions: surprise that the information was public, anger at being exposed, and finally, desperation. "That's completely blown out of proportion," she said, but her voice was shaky now. "I was simply documenting violations of community guidelines. If people would dress appropriately and follow the rules, none of this would have been necessary." "What about the distribution of these photos to third parties?" Patricia pressed. "Can you explain why you were sharing images of community members with people outside our HOA?" Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. Robert whispered something urgent in her ear, and she shook her head. "I don't have to answer these questions in this forum," she said finally. "This is harassment disguised as an investigation." But the damage was done. The community had heard enough to understand that Linda wasn't the pillar of virtue she'd presented herself as. More importantly, other victims were finding their voices. Sarah Williams stood up from her seat near the back. "I want everyone to know that Linda Hartwell took photos of me working out without my permission," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. "She made me feel so uncomfortable and violated that I eventually stopped using the gym I pay for through my HOA fees. And when I complained, I was told that I should be more understanding of community concerns." 2 other women stood up with similar stories. Then Tom Rodriguez confirmed that he'd witnessed the photography and had found it disturbing enough to mention to other neighbors. The meeting ended with the board voting unanimously to suspend Linda's access to all community amenities pending the outcome of the police investigation. But the real victory came later that evening when Detective Chen called to tell me they'd found over 200 photos on Linda's devices, many of them focused on women's bodies in compromising positions. The investigation would eventually reveal that Linda had been part of an online network that traded voyeuristic photos taken in gyms, pools, and other fitness facilities. Her community standards crusade had been cover for a criminal enterprise that violated the privacy and dignity of dozens of women over several years. But the story wasn't over yet. Because sometimes, the most satisfying justice comes not from courts or police, but from the simple truth being exposed to the people who matter most. And Linda Hartwell was about to learn that when you build your reputation on lies and prejudice, it can all come crashing down in a single moment of truth. More importantly, for our community, the investigation had led to changes that protected everyone. The HOA implemented new policies about photography in common areas, installed proper security in the fitness center, and created a formal process for harassment complaints that couldn't be influenced by board connections or long-time resident status. But the most meaningful change was in the community itself. Linda's exposure had opened up conversations about inclusion, about the difference between legitimate community standards and discriminatory